Thank you folks for joining. We're going to get started in just a moment. All right. Well, oh, it looks like folks are still trickling in. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest RadTech speaker series. I'm Albert Fox Cahn with the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, and this is our monthly speaker series in partnership with RadTech, a meetup group focused on technology issues here in New York City, where we discuss emerging concerns in public policy, tech surveillance, and everything in between. And this month we have a very timely session on something that a lot of people seem to be talking about at the moment, election security. And we have two amazing experts for this today. Gowri Ramachandran is counsel at the Brennan Center's Democracy program. She's on leave from her position as a professor at Southwestern School of Law. She serves on the Ninth Circuit's Fairness Committee and is a graduate of many prestigious institutions, including Yale Law School, Yale College, a statistics degree from Harvard University, and really just so glad to have your expertise for this conversation, as well as Derek Tisler, who's a fellow with the Brennan Center's Democracy program as well. He's an attorney and a recent graduate of the University of Chicago Law School, where he served as editor-in-chief of the University of Chicago's Legal Forum. He also holds a BA in economics from Michigan State University. So thank you both. Really excited to just talk about these issues. And as I'll remind folks throughout, we really want this to be as interactive as possible. We know in the age of Zoom, it's very easy to become just another face on yet another screen. And so we want to hear about the questions that all of you have. What is keeping you up at night? What has had you most concerned? Not just about the election we had in 2020, but the elections that are coming soon, the special election, the midterms. I mean, these are issues that really keep coming up over and over again. And so happy to talk about any of those issues that are top of mind for you. So please feel free at any time to ask a question using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you just type a question there, we'll make sure to answer those as we're going along. But to start, I just wanted to get a sense of what you thought the major steps were that officials took to harden our election infrastructure in advance of this year's presidential election. Happy to have either of you go first on that.
Yeah, so I can jump in first on this question. So first, thank you for, inviting us to be on this panel and be able to, discuss election issues with everyone here. So I think, when we look at what the major differences were since 2016, I think that what stands out the most is just a new level of awareness about election security. We see election officials at the state and local level just learning to think about election security as a critical component of election administration in a way that they didn't necessarily do before 2016 and before so many new vulnerabilities were brought to light. And so in the past 4 years, there's been a huge focus on just training people to have better cybersecurity awareness. There's been a focus on information sharing across different jurisdictions in order to share best practices, share threats, share anything else. There's been an increased focus on sort of examining your systems and testing them for vulnerabilities. And then, along with the information sharing, there's just greater relationships across government levels. So we see local election officials working more closely with their state election officials. We see both of those groups working more closely with the federal government, being a little bit more open with resources and with information. Going along with both of those things, there's been just more investment in election security, right? So we've had kind of that preparation and more of the personnel aspect, the awareness, but also real investment in infrastructure. That's been helped with new federal funding from Congress and the amount of $800 million over the past 4 years. And that's allowed states to update old equipment, to hire additional expertise, to conduct greater testing, all those things. And one of the most important changes that has been brought on with those new funds is replacing these outdated paperless voting machines. And these were one of the biggest issues that were really spotlighted after 2016. The fact that, you know, there could be some sort of either a hack on voting equipment, just a bug in voting equipment, whatever it may be, but there'd be no way to independently verify that all of those vote selections were correct. Right, so we've seen a lot of states begin to replace these paperless machines and either go to hand-marked paper ballots or a ballot marking device that will at least print out some sort of paper record of every vote cast. And this year, less than 4% of all votes were cast on paperless machines. I think we're still trying to figure out exactly what that number is, but at most 4%. And none of those votes were cast in the 5 states with the closest margins in the presidential race, right? So this has given us a much greater sense of confidence in our election results because we know we can fall back on those paper records if we ever need to do so.
And that was such a great encapsulation of everything that's been happening in this cycle. And Gowri, maybe I'll turn to you for this next question. Why did it take so long? Because these issues that Derek was referencing, I'm thinking in particular of, you know, the vulnerabilities of electronic voting machines without paper backups, a lot of the invulnerability of other forms of our election infrastructure. These are things that people have been talking about for years. What do you think it took to make this front of mind for so many people? And should we have been addressing these issues sooner?
That's a great question. I think for sure, in terms of what it was that, you know, served as a wake-up call and for people to start paying attention, closer attention to these concerns, I think it was, you know, the Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out after investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, and also Special Counsel Mueller's report and some of his indictments in particular, I think really raised awareness of this issue. I do think along with that, there has been a sort of increased attention to cybersecurity in general. You know, in the last 5 or more years, we've been seeing you know, I don't know the exact number, but it feels to me like an exponential increase in publicized ransomware attacks on private sector entities, small government units, municipalities. And so that's bringing a lot more attention, I think, to cybersecurity in general. But I do think the primary thing that really woke people up was that Senate intelligence report investigating the Russian interference in the 2016 elections, and, you know, sort of realizing that election security is about more than just, you know, protecting against some local, small-time, corrupt political machine. It's also about defending against, you know, sophisticated foreign intelligence agents and intending to attack the infrastructure.
I think that one thing that's been very interesting to observe as someone who's not doing this work day to day, but is very interested in it from the outside, is just how so much of this election infrastructure we've tried for years to depoliticize, we've tried to insulate from partisan politics, and yet so much of the work around the 2016 election and election interference in that campaign has been turned into a partisan issue. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you think that has sort of impacted some of the work at the federal, state, and local level to harden our election infrastructure. Is that something that's turning into a roadblock, or is that something that election officials are able to work around?
So I think, you know, in many ways, we're in a political environment where everything is so incredibly polarized. And I think that goes double when you talk about election systems and you talk about voting rights, you talk about anything that determines political control, right? And so in some ways, I think we're kind of fortunate of how much bipartisan work there has been on election security when you distinguish that from voting rights, even though so often those two issues are actually one and the same. And so you see, even while there is greater polarization, you know, at the federal level, among President Trump and the White House, it hasn't trickled down to the same extent when you start talking to local election officials, you start talking to state election officials, the people who actually run elections in this country where we have a decentralized system. And, you know, I hope that will stay the same after 2020, that there will continue to be at least some bipartisanship here, some opportunity to take these things seriously, to invest where it's needed. So I don't know. I think in many ways we're a little bit fortunate that it hasn't been polarized to the same extent as other issues.
Yeah, and I would chime in as a sort of like current example of that. In Georgia right now, you know, the Secretary of State, Secretary Raffensperger, he is a Republican. The state legislature there is Republican, and he has come under a lot of pressure from folks within his own party over the last week because they're unhappy with the outcome in his state. And he's really stood up to that. So he conducted this risk limiting audit, which I'm sure we'll get into later. And he gave an interview this morning where he said, you know, as a Republican, I'm disappointed in the outcome, but that's the will of the Georgia voter. We've confirmed it. It's done, right? And he thinks calls to, you know, not count everyone's ballot or that sort of thing are just totally illegitimate. So that's a great example of someone who, you know, he's in a very, you know, he's an elected official. He ran on a party platform, right? All of those things, but he's been willing to stand up for having a legitimate election that everyone can be confident in, despite a lot of pressure from within his own party.
And I really do think that is a stunning example, just that, you know, we are seeing that sort of, you know, principled stance, you know, and I'm not saying that because of, you know, partisan preference, just because it would be so easy for so many people in that position to simply play the party line and say what, you know, their colleagues want them to say. And he's, you know, really endured a lot of flack for you know, doing his job and upholding the integrity of the elections, and that's been really powerful to see. Sort of pivoting back to sort of the panoply of improvements we saw this cycle, I was wondering if there was any one particular change that you think really stands out, any one resiliency measure that you think had an outsized role in protecting the integrity of our elections.
I guess I'll take that one. I think the top one for me is actually one that I don't know if everyone used to think of as a resiliency measure, but it was actually, to me, the increased access and options for voters in terms of the different ways in which they could vote, whether it was through the mail, using a drop box, in person during early voting, in person on election day. All of those different options and all of that increased access, sort of increased extension of early voting hours, things like that. That, to my mind, is traditionally thought of as a voting rights issue, but it actually turned out to be an election security resilience measure this year. So, you know, when the pandemic hit, the fact that people could do things like request an absentee ballot online without having to go in person anywhere was really helpful. When people started losing faith in the mail system as we got towards the end of the summer, having those secure drop boxes, or being able to say, hey, I changed my mind, even though I requested an absentee ballot, I'm gonna go vote in person early. Having all of those options available, I think, was actually a security measure to have resilience against these various crises, essentially, that our election system was faced with. So that would actually be the number one for me, but there's a lot of other great examples too.
Amazing. Yeah, I completely agree. Normally I would have thought of that, in that other bucket of voting rights, but it completely makes sense that helped preserve the integrity of the election. Derek, what about you? If you had to choose, is there a specific measure that really you think had a disproportionate impact on election security?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Gowri said. And maybe, another component of it is just sort of the investment in technology, investment in upgrading your systems, investment in greater technical expertise in election administration. And in some ways you see this where having those better systems in place, having more expertise available allowed you to facilitate some of these expanded voting options in an easier way, because you could count on your systems a little bit more, even if you're changing how they were intended to be operated. You can set up new systems a little bit easier, like an online mail ballot request system. And I think when you kind of step back and look at it that way, you see where investing in election security facilitates election accessibility, which then facilitates election security, and investing in these things side by side can really build on each other and just build an overall stronger election system.
It sounds like a very powerful, virtuous cycle framed that way. And just as a reminder to everyone, we want to hear your questions. What's top of mind for you? It can be technical, it can be policy, it can just be big picture. What's the status of election security in America? So what are you most concerned about, both with the election we just had and the elections we have left to come? So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those. So we already started to touch on this a little bit, but I wanted to go back to just the unprecedented impact of COVID-19 on this election. I mean, this was going to be a strange election regardless, given the candidates. But I mean, to have on top of that unprecedented turnout, to have on top of that COVID-19, how did that sort of reshape the threat profile? How did that sort of change, the nature of our elections in the ways that surprised you the most?
Yeah, so I think, the biggest impact of it was just introducing chaos and uncertainty, which, from a security and resiliency perspective is the scariest thing that you can have. Anytime you're trying to, quickly change things, you're trying to get new information to voters as soon as possible. Voters are being introduced to new ways to vote that they may not have ever exercised before. It creates an environment for disinformation. Creates an environment where you may overlook a vulnerability because you're just completely overwhelmed and moving so fast. And we saw this kind of in other sectors as they adjusted to COVID. One of the big thing was as people started working remotely, we saw a huge increase in phishing attacks and ransomware attacks and these other kind of exploitations of this chaos. So I think that's one of the biggest impacts that it had. Two is, as Gowri talked about, so many jurisdictions tried to expand voting options. They tried to expand the availability of mail voting, early in-person voting, and even when there was nothing proactively done to expand the system because they already had no excuse absentee voting, they suddenly had a lot more people who wanted to use those systems. And so when you're layering this in some cases on other changes that are going on, in Georgia and Pennsylvania, they were using new voting machines for the first general election. So these things just start to layer and introduce more uncertainty, introduce more potential issues, and all of that. And then I think a third thing is increased use of kind of online systems, as more people could not go into a government office to request a mail ballot, to register to vote, to update the registration. more people had to go online in order to find where their polling place was, because it may not have been in the same location that it was 2 years ago, 4 years ago, whatever. And so I think there are just a lot of changes and a lot of areas where, you can just introduce the potential for other problems. And so it was that much more important to really just focus on contingencies. Anywhere something might go wrong, like have a plan in place to keep voters voting, to keep things moving along. And I think this really gets at what Gowri was talking about, where when we stretched out voting from 1 day to a 2, 3, 4 week period, it put a lot less stress on these systems and just allowed them to respond a little bit quicker and without disrupting voting too much.
This is giving me flashbacks to my own election experience. And I actually, if it's not prying, I'd love to know how you personally chose to vote, what method you chose. Because for me, this was the first year I legally could vote in-person absentee. We hadn't had that, in-person early in New York. We hadn't had that before. It was the first time I was doing it in a socially distant queue. And so there are all these ways in which the election day experience was completely unrecognizable. Was that your experience, or did you do something you had done before?
It was completely different for me. And, this is my first time voting in New York City, actually. So I had to kind of, learn what the procedures were in New York while also realizing that all those procedures are completely different. So I did end up requesting a mail ballot, and I dropped it off at the early voting location and just decided I was okay with my ballot being counted, 2 weeks after election day or whatever. So that's how I chose to vote this year.
So I actually live out in Los Angeles, and there were a lot of changes to how I voted this year. This is the first year I voted in the primary election, not using a hand-marked paper ballot. So I was used to, in Los Angeles, using a hand-marked paper ballot, and before that, I used to vote in Florida and use a hand-marked paper ballot. So this is the first time in the primary election I used a touchscreen voting machine, and they printed out printout of my choices. And in California, our ballots are very long. So then I spent a good 5 minutes reading through it and making sure everything was correct. And then I placed it in a scanner to have it scanned. And in that election, actually, it was also the first time I had experienced, I didn't personally, because I voted a few days before election day at an early vote site. But on election day, it was the first time I'd lived in a jurisdiction that had hours-long lines. And that was an example of what Derek talked about before. When you're rolling out new technology and new machines, it does mean that there's a lot more room for error and uncertainty. And it does appear that the Los Angeles officials, they had a hard time figuring out, it seems, where to site all these vote centers, how many machines should be at each one, how many check-in stations have to be at each one, and it ended up leading to really, really long lines at some locations. So I actually went out to my neighborhood vote center, the nearest one, and I estimate that the people who kind of ended the night there probably waited in line for 6 hours, actually. So all of that was very new to me. Sorry, I'm getting a emergency alert from the state of California. We get these a lot. But for the general election, I voted absentee for the first time because I didn't want to, wait in line. I also didn't want to contribute to any COVID spread. So I was sent a mail ballot automatically. I didn't have to request one in California. They did that this year. And then I dropped it off in a secure Dropbox so that I wouldn't have to worry about the mail taking a long time or anything like that. And I was able to use a ballot tracking system to find out when it was counted and received about 5 days later.
And what I love about all these stories is, each of us had different options. We had different ways we could approach it and different ways to balance those variables. And because of that sort of flexibility you were talking about earlier, we were all able to find a way that felt comfortable to us and secure to us to exercise that vote. I think that really, that's something I hope continues to only expand in future elections. But looking to the aftermath of the election, I wanted to pivot a bit to just the role of audits in sort of validating the election experience. Tell us a bit about what you see as the scope of audits we need to ensure that the elections are being carried out the way they should be.
Sure, I'll take that one. So there's a lot of different ways to sort of have prevention of malfunctions or cyber attacks, detection of them, and recovery to ensure you have valid election results. And just one of those ways of sort of these layers of protection, one of those things you can do is to have regularly conducted manual audits of those voter verified paper records. There's a few different versions of these sorts of audits that are in place. So in a number of states, there are what's called traditional fixed percentage audits. So what happens there is election officials will take either a sample of precincts or a sample of machines that tabulated ballots and say, we're going to hand count all those ballots. So we're going to have a human, usually a team of humans, actually bipartisan team ideally, look at each ballot and say, you know, who was this actually a vote for? Let's determine the intent of the voter by looking at it, whether it's which bubble did they fill in or what's the printout from their ballot marking device. And they count up all those by hand and check that against the tabulator's total. Like, are we getting the same count by hand as the tabulator did? And there's always some slight discrepancies because people are different from machines. So a machine might count a stray mark as a vote, but a person can see that's just a stray mark. It's not really a vote. Or a machine might fail to pick up a really faint mark, but the human can see it and be pretty confident that was an intentional vote. There's always some discrepancies, but the idea is you want to confirm that there's not, you know, a lot of discrepancies that might indicate sort of misprogramming or hacking even of the machine. Then there's another kind of audit that the Brennan Center is a big promoter of, and that we're getting more and more of as time goes on, and that's called a risk limiting audit. And with a risk limiting audit, the percentage of ballots that you take a look at manually and hand count actually depends on how close the race was. So if it's a really wide margin in a typical race, you only have to sample a small number of ballots, and then you can get some statistical confidence that whichever candidate the tabulator said was the winner is actually the winner. So the idea is not to sort of verify the exact number and the exact count and who won by exactly how much, but rather just that the declared winner is the winner. So when there's a wide margin, you don't have to sample a lot because you can tell pretty quickly, you know, if there was some kind of hack or misprogramming here, it wasn't severe enough to actually flip the outcome. But if it's a really close race, you're going to have to sample a lot more ballots to have that confidence that there wasn't some sort of malicious hack or misprogramming that could have flipped the outcome. And what we all were just seeing over the last week in Georgia actually was a risk limiting audit. So Georgia recently passed a risk limiting audit regulation where they planned to audit one of the statewide races after this November election. And the Secretary of State chose to audit the presidential race, which, as we all know, was an extremely close margin in Georgia. And what that meant is you'd have to sample so many ballots to get that statistical confidence, like whether you want it to be 90 or 95% in the outcome. You'd have to sample so many that it would actually be faster to just count them all and go through and do a random sample of that size. I think it would have been about half the ballots they would have had to do. So what happened is we just saw the largest manual tally of contests in, I believe, American history. There were 5 million votes approximately in Georgia. And these very tired election officials who just went through like conducting a massive election in the middle of a pandemic had to pretty much get up a couple days later after they were done counting the first time and conduct this manual tally. So it was really heroic on the part of these election officials. A whole bunch of volunteers came in to assist. Observers were there, which was wonderful because it helped give everyone confidence and transparency. And they just completed today, and I think eventually the full results will be up, but it appears that yes, the same winner that was declared before is the winner. There are a few discrepancies, like I mentioned, as there always are, but not nearly enough to change the outcome. So hopefully it'll be a learning, there'll be lessons learned from that for the future so that other jurisdictions feel comfortable adopting risk limiting audits and knowing there's going to be ways we can figure out to conduct that full hand tally if we have to, and do it effectively.
So what do you see as the main benefits of the risk limiting audit approach? Is it that it, makes the effort, the scale of the audit proportional to the risk? Is it that it conserves resources for where the audit resources matter most? Is it that, what's the thing that you see as being the best sort of outcome there compared to a 6% audit?
To me, I think the best benefit is actually that conserving resources benefit that you mentioned, because if it's really expensive to audit races, people just aren't going to have the wherewithal to do it on a regular basis. Whereas if usually you only have to sample a small number of ballots, then people will be able to do these audits on a regular basis, like do at least one race after every major election, that sort of thing. And so that way people will get used to auditing. It'll become, part of the culture, part of the practice. And so if there are, misprogramming or hacking, we're more likely to catch it if we're auditing regularly. And it's also a preventative measure, right? If everyone knows that elections in the United States are audited regularly, then, the temptation to try to change the outcome is much lower.
That makes a lot of sense. And thinking about, sort of policies going forward, obviously risk limiting audits is one. What do you think the best steps a Biden administration could take in the early months in office to help sort of augment the work you're doing, the work that local and state election officials are doing? Obviously there were career officials in the current administration who've done a lot of great work to help harden our election infrastructure, but now there seems to be, an opportunity to have support from the very top potentially in pushing through additional protections.
Yeah, so I think there's a few different things that could play out beneficially for election security. One thing I would hope to see is just continued support for getting more funds to election officials. I think election administration has just been woefully underfunded for a very long time. And now it's just, they are having to deal with more challenges than ever. And we saw that on election security. And it's sort of, what I talked about at the beginning of our discussion, where election officials are just changing what they see as their responsibilities, and ensuring security and integrity of our elections. And then of course we just came out of an election under a pandemic where election officials were suddenly doing things that they've just never had to do before. So I think just getting support to help address these challenges and getting reliable and continued funding to election officials. In some cases, we saw with the most recent grants of money from Congress in 2018 and 2019 for election security, there was actually hesitation to spend it on some of the most needed things, because you can spend a lot of money to replace your voting equipment, but if there's no guarantee you're going to have more money to maintain that voting equipment or maintain those new systems you put in place, then really you can't afford it at all. And so I think that is something I would like to see, and something that could happen either way in terms of who ends up controlling the U.S. Senate, because we have seen some bipartisan agreement on this before. Obviously, depending on how things go in Georgia, there could be a whole realm of other legislative activity in the election security space. But then going more directly to, what the Biden administration can do. And I think the biggest thing is just treating cybersecurity seriously, treating election security seriously, treating the threat of foreign interference seriously, and just having that leadership there. We certainly saw many, tremendous things on election security that the federal government did to prepare us for 2020 under the leadership of CISA particularly. But at the top of the executive branch was a president who was undercutting the message at every opportunity. And obviously this week we saw that to the largest extreme when President Trump fired the director of CISA.
And sorry, just for those less familiar with DHS jargon, could you let everyone know what CISA stands for?
Yeah, of course. So that's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. I think I got that right. But they're the agency within the federal government who plays the largest role in monitoring threats to election security and coordinating with state and local officials to make sure they have the information, the training, the resources they need to address election security issues. And so I think I would like to see, you know, just pushing those steps forward, building on everything we did in the last 4 years, but then investing more resources, putting more staff into it, sharing more information and resources with state and local officials, and then also coordinating strategy across federal departments so that it's not only this one small part of the federal government that's really working towards that goal. I don't know, Gowri, is there kind of other things you might be excited about with the future administration in this space?
I think that would be the main thing. And I think that, you know, it wouldn't quite be something that, you know, President Biden himself, you know, does like through an executive order, that sort of thing. But the EAC, the Election Assistance Commission, they, I think there are some more sort of proactive things that they could do in the vendor regulation space, even in the absence of federal legislation. And I think that would be an exciting thing to see push forward. But certainly, and this would require legislation most likely, they certainly need you know, the funding and the support to be able to, you know, act more aggressively in that space.
Definitely. And we'll get to that a bit more in detail later, but I wanted to go to our first audience question first. And that's about sort of the Defcon voting village. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but you know, members of the public are given access to voting machines and the opportunity to try to hack into them. And just what's your thoughts about that, about the media reporting on that, and how it impacts, you know, broader trust in the election system?
So I'll take that one. So I actually think that, you know, having the opportunity for white hat hackers or bug bounty programs and these sorts of things are in the long run helpful in terms of building confidence in elections and in election security. So knowing that systems have been subject to that kind of testing and that kind of, you know, intentional undermining, but and have, you know, that vendors have learned from those things and then have improved their systems, you know, having open source code so that things can actually be tested. Those things I think in general are actually a good cybersecurity practice. I think just keeping everything private and saying, trust us, you know, our machines are air gassed, nothing can happen to them. I think in the long run, that's, you know, that doesn't really last for sure. So I think that it, you know, definitely provides, might be sensationalist sometimes, but I think the concept can be in the long run a helpful one.
Yeah, and I think historically we've seen so many examples of vendors claiming to have magic sauce on security and, you know, oh, it's completely impenetrable, but we won't let you see any of the source code. And then when people do get their hands on it, find vulnerabilities that the vendor never knew about or never wanted to disclose. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. I want to go back to something that's become a really pronounced election security issue in recent years, and really, I mean, it's probably been one to a lesser degree in the past, but I never really thought about it, and that's disinformation. What is the impact of, you know, public statements about election integrity that are false, that on the integrity of the system itself? How do you think that rhetoric is having a lasting impact on the security and integrity of our elections?
Yeah, Absolutely, yes. I think it is having just an incredible detrimental impact on just public confidence in elections. I think it becomes especially difficult, especially what we've been seeing in the past few weeks, where it's sort of detached from reality, frankly, and being pushed without any evidence, in some cases, even like kernel of truth within it, to the point where me trying to debunk a piece of misinformation, it takes me so long to figure out like what it is they're actually referring to that, it's hard to actually get better information out there. But yeah, I think it is like certainly one of the things that concerns me the most going forward, because there's just not very easy answers for it. I think there have been a lot of people doing incredible work to inform the public about election administration, about election security, especially leading up to this unprecedented election. The fact that there was so much public acceptance of the idea that we might not know who the winner is on election night is an incredible accomplishment. And I think just the tremendous feat for public education and getting voters to accept and understand something that they're not used to and that they haven't seen yet. So to that extent, I think there are things that can be done, but just to the extent that there are a lot of people in their own information ecosystems, it's concerning about the ability to breach those.
Gowri, what about you? Do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I do think it's really concerning, and just in an academic sense, I actually think it's really fascinating and hope more people do research into sort of what techniques actually work to counter disinformation and counter that sort of thing, because we're certainly, even though ultimately I think the disinformation about the election didn't work because we had the historic turnout, right? We had the most turnout we've had since in 100 years. So ultimately it means the voters, I don't think they thought it was rigged because they took all that time to vote, right? And they thought it was worth it. But I think there's been enough sort of success in terms of sowing confusion and that sort of thing with all the disinformation that certainly it's going to be something that has to be combated for many years to come, I expect. So I think it's actually an area that is ripe for, I hope, really productive research into what kinds of things work and what don't.
Completely. I know that some of my colleagues are doing really great work trying to examine that type of effort right now, and just how do you mobilize those approaches in the coming years. All right, another question that just came in from the audience. There's been a lot of election security news recently, but also a lot of big tech news. This week we saw Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey before the Senate and talked about disinformation broadly. But what do you think is the role of social media specifically? What do you think the platform's obligations are? What do you think the obligations of other media gatekeepers are to regulate this threat?
Yeah, so I think similarly, I think this is a difficult question and something that I'm hoping that there will continue to be a close study of going forward in order to figure out what works. I certainly think we saw the major social media companies respond in a different way this year than they did in 2016, and seem to be a little bit less caught off guard by some of the misinformation activities that were taking place on their platforms. And we seem to almost be able to watch them learn in real time how to deal with these things. We saw Twitter kind of testing out all kinds of different little flags for talking about disputed election information, or different ways that they phrased it. they seem to be kind of fine-tuning how exactly they want to be dealing with misinformation, particularly when it's coming from, our political leaders, where censorship becomes a much more difficult question, certainly. So, we're going to continue to see this evolve a lot. And I think it may take some time before we really understand what the right approach is. What actually works, first of all, on cutting down, actual voter suppression tactics, where you are purposely pushing out lies in order to prevent someone from voting. And then getting into, just trying to undermine public confidence in elections. I think it's going to take some time to really figure out what can actually cut down on those messages in a way that balances some of our other, free speech and democratic values.
Yeah, and I think I'll add to that, some of what we sort of saw happening, I think, with a lot of the big social media platforms is they were learning that, it's in their interest to be socially responsible as powerful private entities. And they were kind of, I think almost in real time, we were witnessing them grow and realize that, non-government actors can be extremely powerful and have important public responsibilities. And so I think that was fascinating, but I do think like a lot more work has to be done on their part and the part of others in terms of figuring out, what's the best approach for them to take, what is the most socially responsible approach, and what's really going to work. If one major player starts taking a really socially responsible approach, but someone who's really seeking to, propagate disinformation just tells all his or her followers, let's jump to this other not socially responsible platform, how much good has really been done. So I think it's something that, similar to just combating disinformation in general, I think there's a lot more room for sort of research and thinking about what's the best approach and what's flexible enough, honestly, I think, to really adapt to what is probably going to be a kind of changing sort of threat.
And it seems like at some point we'll have to have a much deeper conversation as a country about how we move from, de facto self-regulation of these platforms to some sort of codified governmental standard for speech on these platforms when it, undermines the integrity of the election. And of course, that raises a whole slew of First Amendment issues that aren't present when we're dealing with private actors. But, if we see people simply self-selecting into unfiltered platforms where they can continue to spread this content, that, it's going to pose that same threat. All right, another audience question. Please keep these coming. The more, the better. So looking abroad, what have we learned from other countries and their election security practices? Who's doing this right? And more specifically, who did a particularly good job of responding to the challenges that COVID-19 posed for election security?
That's a really great question, especially the second half of this question, because it's something that has puzzled me a little bit, because many people praised South Korea. They held an election while their COVID outbreak was still, still really ongoing, and they had not really suppressed it fully through testing and contact tracing. And there was plenty of turnout, and it seemed like it was a very, very successful election. And at the time, I thought, wow, maybe we're going to get to go to South Korea as part of our job and learn, or at least do a Zoom call with South Korea and learn, learn what they were able to do and how they were able to quickly adapt and run a sort of safe and healthy election during the pandemic. But it was interesting to me how there was not a lot of, adoption of those practices quickly or that sort of thing. And I guess to some extent, it was really a symptom of, the United States didn't really adopt some of the best practices in just suppressing COVID itself, aside from conducting elections during a pandemic. When there were things that looked like they were working, we were kind of slow to follow course. So I guess it's another example of that. But I thought it was really impressive how when, there wasn't much science yet, there wasn't much to go on in terms of exactly how the virus is transmitted, what helps to reduce transmission. I don't think people realized yet that being outside was really helpful, in reducing transmission, and yet they seemed to run a really great election. They had special voting booths for persons who were positive and special hours where COVID positive persons could come and vote to make sure that everyone had the opportunity to vote regardless of their health status. And so I thought that was really impressive personally.
That's astounding. They were encouraging people to effectively congregate even when they were COVID positive. I had no idea. And we've done a fair amount of work looking at the contact tracing model there and response to COVID. But I hope you get that trip, because it seems like there's a lot there to learn from. Derek, what about you?
Yeah, I think Gowri made a really smart point about the way that, our response kind of paralleled other aspects of our country's COVID response and our kind of failure to adopt some best practices from overseas. I think another place you might see that is the fact that we have such decentralized election administration, whereas so many other countries, it's much more centralized, much more professionalized, less political, and that all allows for movement in one direction, a national strategy, uniform rules, things that we did not see in America. We had, thousands of election jurisdictions all doing things a little bit different, every state doing things a little bit different, no clear direction whatsoever. Obviously the federal government's role in election administration is very small right now in our country. But yeah, no sort of, consistent message around election administration and sort of what are the best ways to deal with these challenges.
And I'm actually interested on that point, because I keep going back and forth on this. I hear a lot of conflicting views on this. To what extent is decentralization helpful or harmful when it comes to election security? Because yes, it makes it much harder to adopt uniform best practices. It makes it much harder to have that sort of swift adoption of a uniform COVID response. But at the same time, it makes it a lot harder to sort of attack multiple states, multiple jurisdictions at the same time, because, we've effectively, air capped all of these systems just by building them so chaotically and having them all operate separately.
Yeah, I think it's true. I think it's a blessing and a curse. The decentralization of election administration, it definitely makes it much harder for particularly, like a foreign actor to interfere in a way that's going to change, the outcome of a presidential election or that sort of thing. So I think it's a huge blessing in that way. But it is definitely with problems when it comes to dealing with the kind of, hopefully about once every 100 years crisis, like the one that we're going through now.
Yeah, I think in many ways it's, just some of the same back and forth that you see anytime you talk about federalism, right? When you decentralize things more, when you have different layers of administration over a particular issue, you may see a little bit more of that laboratories of democracy effect. People trying to find new best practices that can then be adopted by different jurisdictions. You can also, if you have a federal government who is very opposed to mail voting, for instance, that will not trickle all the way down through the system, there is room for pushback. So I think that's right. It's certainly a give and take there when it comes to all aspects of our election administration, security, accessibility, everything. And it even when people talk about the ways that other countries centralize it, professionalize it, whatever, it seems difficult to think that we could just drop a new system in place in our country with our political environment and expect the same results that we see in other countries. Yeah, I think there's a real trade-off there.
All right, well, we only have 3 minutes left, but I didn't want to let this end without sort of going back to that point around vendors and what we can do to actually hold them better to account for the role they're playing in creating this election equipment and being a part of our infrastructure. So just quickly, what do you think are the top items there in terms of new regulations we need, new restrictions, and steps that officials can take?
Sure, I'll take that one and hopefully be quick. Certainly Brennan Center is in favor of a sort of comprehensive system of regulation at the federal level for vendors. But absent that, if we want to have like some sort of quicker items on the menu, I definitely think regulating electronic poll book vendors and vendors who support voter registration databases are like the two big priorities. A lot of the sort of long lines and issues we saw at the polls in 2020 were actually the result of electronic poll book issues or the result of really poorly, inefficiently configured voter registration databases, because sometimes poll workers have to dial into a registration database to check if someone's already voted or that sort of thing, especially when you have all these multiple forms of voting going on. So I think those are two big priorities. They would make things more secure against foreign attack. We know that Russian actors were attacking our voter registration databases in 2016, so they would also improve access for voters and convenience for voters.
Wonderful. That was very quick. I really appreciate it, but a lot of different types of reforms to digest. And one thing I will quickly add that we've been sort of a bit alarmed about was the use of artificial intelligence for signature verification. And we would love to see additional auditing of that, especially potential concerns around bias in the way those systems operate. So lots of vendors out there, lots of people making money off of the elections, and definitely a need to comprehensively make sure they're doing their job well. But really, thank you again for joining us for this conversation, for just giving us such an incredible look at just the way our elections are functioning and how they can function even better. And thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you'll join us next month for our next installment of RadTech, where we'll be looking at how the move to defund police may in some cases lead to an increase in surveillance and what we can do to prevent that. So thank you all. Stay safe. Have a very happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.